The stats for playtest 5 of Dark and Darker were released recently, and right off the bat, there are two important things to note about these stats, and to keep in mind throughout the rest of this analysis, and in any case where anyone is citing these stats. The first is the nature of the test itself. This test was small. It was a lot shorter than last test, being only 5 days, and it was also smaller in terms of player base. Not all countries were included in this test, and not all languages were given localization. Dark and Darker was not on Steam, and required a more difficult method of downloading and playing. This can be considered a filter for the player base, as new players and players who are less dedicated to the game are less likely to be willing to put up with the process of downloading the game outside of Steam. This test has a limited time frame, a smaller player base with a smaller selection of regions, and the player base itself is more likely to be familiar with the game. While this may sound good for our data in terms of specificity, there's a second factor to keep in mind. The data Iron Mace provided is less detailed than last test, at least when it comes to the useful class performance metrics we were using last time. Last test, there was a table that showed the division of games, kills, and downs across normal lobbies, goblin caves, and high roller. This time around, no such table exists. This means all we have to go on is the average across all games and the top 200. There's no way to analyze how the classes performed in the ruins versus the crypts, or to see how well the whole of High Roller did. Last test, I mentioned that any analysis of the data had to be taken with a grain of salt due to the limited nature of the data, and that applies even more this time around. We got less data, not more. With this in mind, we immediately hit our first roadblock. The play count chart provided by Iron Mace doesn't match the play count numbers shown in the chart directly below it. At first I figured this would be no big deal. I'll just make my own pie chart out of the numbers provided and rely on that for future analysis. But then I went to compare it to our first metric from last analysis, the cell count. And the cell count looks much closer to the Iron Mace chart than it does to mine. This would make sense because we would expect each class to extract with a somewhat similar amount of gold. It correlates much more smoothly, and it matches another stat that Iron Mace provided, that being the average gold value earned between each class. If we were to use my chart, we'd conclude that Bard made up 9% of players but only 1.9% of items sold, which is such an extreme difference that it's absurd. But the average gold earned chart doesn't show this extreme of a difference, with Bard usually performing at about 70 to 90% of the top performers. You would not expect an average performance of 70% to result in such a drastically low outcome. That being said, the average gold value chart refers to the value of the items you extract with, while we assume that cell count refers to what was sold to NPCs. It's possible that valuable items were either used by the player, sold to other players, or simply accidentally not sold, so we can't directly compare these two metrics. But still, there seems to be a major inconsistency here, and it puts a massive cloud of doubt over any possible analysis of this data. If we can't be sure of even just our player count metric, then how can we compare it to any other metric with confidence? This is where Iron Mace's stats cause a roadblock. We don't know exactly what these metrics mean, nor do we have the dataset that they extract from. We simply have the labels and numbers provided, and have to try and piece together what we can from that. Last test, certain data was provided that made this process easier and allowed for more confidence, but this time around, it's not so simple. That being said, anything from here on out should be considered with a large degree of skepticism. For the sake of consistency, I'm going to be proceeding by using the numbers provided in the play kill down chart, as it's the same source I used in the last analysis. I would hope that it's pulling from the same type of data as playtest 4, but it's just a hopeful assumption that cannot be proven. It just seems like the safest bet to go with. It's the only one that provides exact numbers, which is useful for comparing it with cell and kill counts. Just like last time, we'll start with the cell count. Fighter and Rogue both overperform by a significant amount, while Cleric, Barbarian, and Ranger all perform about as expected. Wizard's play rate is only 10.6%, while their cell count is an even smaller 4.79%. And Bard is in an even worse spot, having 9.4% play rate and 2.9% cell count. If we want to compare these to last playtest, it requires us to omit Bard from the data, and upon doing so, we can see that Wizard and Fighter both slightly dropped in play rate, while Cleric went from second lowest to third highest. In terms of cell count, Fighter is still top dog, but Ranger's former second place position was usurped by Rogue. All in all, the distribution is relatively similar, with 3 classes making up about 65% of the cell count, Wizard doing terribly, and the remaining classes being about equal. Rogue and Fighter went up, Wizard, Barbarian, and Ranger went down, and Cleric stayed about the same. I've also included exact ratios of cell count to games played. It's still not clear what cell count means. It could mean number of items sold, or amount of gold required through selling, but either way, we can see that on average, Fighter and Rogue did about 5 times as well as Bard. Next, we'll have a look at kill count. Here, we see an extreme overperformance from both Rogue and Fighter, and interestingly, the exact same performance from Barbarian as last test. Last test, Barb's overall performance was a ratio of 1.37 kills to games, and it's identical in this test. The other notable change goes to Cleric, who went from a measly 0.53 kills per game to 1.04, about the same as Ranger in last test. Ranger themselves went down, but not significantly, while Wizard went slightly up, but also not significantly. Bard does about as well as you'd expect, performing even worse than the worst class of last test. Worth noting here is that, overall, the number of games and kills are only about 10% of last tests. Last test, we saw 33 million each of kills and games, but this test, we only see about 4 million of each. Our sample size is much smaller, as expected, but its performance is actually better overall, as predicted as well. The overall ratio went from 0.98 kills to games to 1.15, which is a significant jump. And finally, let's take a look at High Roller, or at least the top 200. Because we don't have the individually categorized data for each map, all we can look at is the top 200, which, as we learned last analysis, is not indicative of the whole of High Roller. Upon viewing Iron Mesa's charts, you might be alarmed to see that Ranger is occupying 55 of the top 200 spots for Killer Outlaw, which is a pretty extreme amount of players for one class. But quantity doesn't necessarily imply quality. While Ranger accounts for over 25% of the top 200 spots, they actually have the second lowest ratio of kills per player, only barely surpassing Cleric. The ratio is more important here, as it shows the performance of the class, not just the representation. As we isolate ourselves higher and higher in the ranks, from top 100 to top 50, we start to see that, once again, Barbarian has the best ratio of kills per player, only this time Wizard is not in second, but in third, outpaced by Rogue. All three have similar ratios throughout, with Barb being slightly better off than Rogue, and Rogue being slightly better off than Wizard. And the gap between Rogue and Wizard gets wider as you go from top 50 to top 200. And sadly, that's about all I have in terms of useful data to show. The rest of the stats show us things like which items were brought out of the dungeon the most, or what monster killed players, or what countries people played from, but we all know what we're really here for. Let's talk class performance. Let's go in the same order as last time. First up, we have Rogue. Rogue was extremely average last test. The same cannot be said for this test. Rogue was the recipient of many new tools. They received Double Jump, which is probably the hottest debate topic of the test, and a new map was added that Double Jump was particularly effective on. They received new pieces of headgear, ones that provided them with stats like Strength and all attributes, as well as a new ranged option. Any ranged option is a massive benefit for a class, and a mobile class like Rogue can use ranged options especially well. One of their main weapons, the Rapier, was significantly buffed, likely to make Bard more usable, but indirectly buffing other classes who would use the weapon more effectively. They received a perk that gave them +2 all attributes for free, providing them effectively 10 more base stat points than any other class. And they were indirectly buffed by the game's overall nerf to damage and attribute enchantments on gear, as now Rogue is less likely to get one-shot. This all seems alarming, and I'm well aware of how many calls there are for a Rogue nerf, but personally I'm hesitant to call for such things. Rogue received many new toys and buffs, far more than any other class in this test, but that's just it. Other classes are sure to receive similar treatment in the future, with new mechanics and gear that will push their power levels up. At least, that's my personal optimistic hope. Regardless of what direction you think the class should be taken, Rogue seems to have overperformed this test. Sadly, we can't know how much of an impact map design in particular had on their performance. Cleric can be found performing much better in the kills department, but not much better elsewhere. This is likely thanks to their newfound offensive spells, as well as the ability to recharge their spells by resting, allowing them to more freely and frequently buff themselves. Seeing their offensive stats rise makes sense, because now they have more offensive options. Fighter's average performance skyrocketed, keeping about even with Rogue, although they fell off in the top 200, same as last test. It's hard to say exactly what caused this skyrocket in performance. It's definitely not Adrenaline Rush's buff, as looking at the skill usage rates shows that the usual build is still Sprint and Second Wind. Same goes with Slayer. It could be a variety of factors. Maybe Fighter was always a strong class, but has a higher skill ceiling than that of Barbarian, thanks to their weapon variety and unique counterattack capabilities, and so the player base being filtered led them to perform better. Maybe Fighter was treated as a better Ranger, as Ranger players found the new ammo system to be too restrictive, and so players who wanted to benefit from bows and crossbows decided to play Fighter instead to better cover their bases when out of ammo. Maybe Fighters started to specialize more into damage reduction, and the dip in Wizard players meant that there was less fear of being countered. Or maybe it's the all-impactful 8 HP bandage they spawned with. These are all potential theories. It could be one, or some, or all, or none of them. It's hard to say with Fighter, as their average performance in the last test was very high as well, but without the full map-based stats, it's hard to say if they were truly overperforming. They certainly aren't overperforming in top 200, at least. Barbarian is in a weird spot. Their performance matches that of last test, with an identical kill-to-game ratio on the whole, and them still being the best class in top 200. This sounds fine, but we have to keep in mind what changes were made to Barbarian. Barbarian did get mostly nerfed this test, with attribute and damage stacking getting toned down across all gear, as well as various buff spells that contributed to the buff ball meta getting nerfed. And while I personally believe that Achilles Strike was an extreme buff to the class, looking at the usage stats shows that the skill was hardly even used. I've received comments about how players didn't even know the skill existed, or that they assumed it required a literal hit to the ankle, so it's very possible that this skill flew under the radar. So on average, Barbarian was being played as a nerfed version, but performed about the same as last test, even as other classes got buffed, and the overall player base was likely at a higher average skill level. It's hard to say what this means for Barbarian, but at the very least, they're the most consistent class between the two tests. There's really not a lot to say about Ranger. Their overall performance is about the same, and their top 3 placement was seemingly taken by Rogue, but that could potentially be explained by them simply having less inventory space to carry things to sell. They do still perform well in terms of kills, not too far off from Wizard in the top 50, and they're still massively overrepresented in the rest of the top 200 categories. There's really not much for me to say about them that I haven't already said in the last analysis, other than that it's surprising that their ammo rework didn't really impact their proportion of the player count. And same goes for Wizard. Wizard is doing the same as last test, although worse, thanks to their nerfed base stats and casting speeds. While recovering spells while sitting down or drinking clarity potions is a nice quality of life change, it seems to have done nothing to bring their average performance up, especially not enough to compensate for them losing 5 will and 5 agility. And keep in mind, this is with the filtered player base. I said it in the last analysis, and I'll say it again. Wizard does horribly on average and only starts to shine at the absolute highest levels with the best gear, and even then, they're outperformed by other classes that have a much lower skill floor and skill ceiling. Personally, I do not understand why they've been nerfed again after last test, especially in a way that hurts their average players far more than it hurts their best players. In terms of healthy balance philosophy, it just doesn't make sense. And finally, the newcomer, Bard. Bard is terrible. We all saw this coming, I really don't need to explain this. Bard as a whole is not a finished class, obviously. Maybe as new perks and skills come into the game, we'll see how they really do, but for now, it's best to just ignore their performance entirely. And that's about it. Again, take all of this with a massive grain of salt. All of the disclaimers I gave last time apply tenfold to this analysis. There is not nearly enough data to answer all the questions I had in mind, and there's no way to see how each class performed outside of the average and in the top 200. This is, as we might say, a low-resolution analysis. There's not enough information to get a clear picture, and depending on how you squint your eyes and look at it, you might see all sorts of different things. And if someone were to tell you, that's a cat, that would definitely influence how you perceive that low-resolution image. Sure, I might have some theories and explanations here, but it just goes to show just how easily someone can present incomplete data to support their arguments. In reality, there's not enough data here to make any specific claims, especially when I'm not even sure whether the player count numbers are accurate. All of this could just be straight up wrong. I'm certainly hoping it's not, but there's no way to tell unless Ironbase suddenly releases more specific information. So please, keep that in mind when looking at this test's stats and drawing conclusions from them, and from any statistics in general. Make sure you know the quality of the data you're working with, and monitor your confidence in your conclusions accordingly.